Good evening. It is the tradition, and a good one, for on Good Friday to remember the words that Jesus speaks of all things as he's hanging in excruciating pain, dying on a cross. So one would imagine that these are pretty important words. And so there are 7 different times when Jesus speaks. And we will recall them, we will relive them as we journey through this Holy Week on this most difficult of days. But we know that Easter is coming, and certainly invite you to be a part of that celebration. But for tonight, this is a reminder of just how far God is willing to go to try to keep every single one of us on the path of eternity. The first word. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the 2 do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then Pilate asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. From Luke 23, 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Indeed, there was also an inscription above him that said, "This is the King of the Jews." We sing, "Were You There?" Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree?
one of the criminals who were hanged there, kept deriding Jesus and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked the first one, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." If you were part of last night's worship, then hopefully you recall that Monday means commandment. It's Maundy Thursday, and amongst other things, it's the day when Jesus commands us not only to love each other, but to love in the way that he loves us. And so today, that takes on a new level of meaning. Because here is Jesus, from what we call the first word, saying, "Forgive them." And not just that, but they don't know what they're doing. That's an interesting thing for us to consider. Such a horrific act. Hopefully for those of you online, you can get a sense of the crown of thorns. Maybe those of you who are present, if you've never looked at it, you should. It's most disquieting. I remember when I first came here, we had a different thorn crown. It looked more like a rose bush thorn. It would hurt. But I don't know where you get thorns like this. It's incredulous how anyone would want to inflict such pain on another human being. And the different ways in which they derided Jesus. I mean, even if you thought he wasn't who he said he was, why would you do that? And why did we as humans concoct such horrible ways like crucifixion? It's one thing if you want to execute someone, but this is just downright cruel. And in that context, Jesus says, forgive them, because they really just don't understand. And the takeaways for us, when we sin, when our lives are broken, when we choose paths that are other than God's preference, is that how he responds? I forgive you. Even though you did great harm, perhaps, you were confused, misled. That kind of charity, sympathy, empathy. And so you turn to the second word. The two people hung on either side of Jesus. And the profound way that love takes a next step. One assumes that the second criminal who speaks
had a rather shady life. And yet, just in recognizing Jesus to be somehow, at some minuscule level, who he claimed to be, who he is, was enough for Jesus to say to this man, today you're going to join me in paradise. You put the first and the second ones together, and you find quite the compelling case for us, who make so many mistakes, who let down people around us, and ultimately, then therefore let down God significantly. And yet, when we come into God's presence, he says, I forgive you. You were confused. And when your earthly days are over, you will join me in paradise. The third word. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So there are three Marys. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, which we assume to be John, standing beside her, Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. You know, it says that Jesus emptied himself, i.e., my understanding of that which is unique to God. And so as he hangs on a cross, he experiences every single piece of excruciating pain that any human would. You know, we talk about the body of Christ, how it is to be connected to one another through being connected to Jesus. And this, in a way, is like the first step of the church. It's the beginning of the church. When Jesus says, "You two are connected now through me." Of course, for Mary, the Mary, not only was this the death of her son, that's far more than enough, but in those days, obviously something happens to Joseph. We don't know what. We can only assume he died some time ago. So now there was really no future for Mary. Women in that society at that time, if they were on their own, if there wasn't a man in their life, could only hope for poverty, could only hope for getting leftovers that people would leave in the fields. So here is Jesus being concerned about others. At this juncture, not talking about any of his pain, not talking about anything really about himself. This is for those precious people that are before him. And he says, take care of one another. Look out for one another. In fact, you are a part of the family of God. Live as if you were mother and son.
Have that kind of love between you. Have that kind of concern for one another. That, sometimes people, not always sure why, but sometimes we say, well, yeah, I got problems, but other people got bigger problems. So we belittle our own issues. Jesus is making the point here that it doesn't matter whatever your issue is. It doesn't matter whatever else God has on his plate. He has time, he has concern for every detail of your life. The fourth word. And about 3 o'clock, about 6 hours later, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, this man is calling for Elijah. Well, hopefully you understand that my God in Aramaic, Eli, sounds like Elijah. So they thought, maybe he's calling for Elijah. But certainly all of the hearers knew exactly what he was doing, because in those days, every single Jew put into their memory all 150 Psalms. They could recite any of the Psalms. It was their hymnal. And so this is Psalm 22. That's how it starts. My God, why have you forsaken me? And it's certainly been a point of all sorts of theological departures through the years of what does this mean? Why would Jesus say that? Was he truly somehow separated from God at this point in time? You can go wherever you like, but I think there are a couple things that we glean. One is, this really does show us that Jesus fully understands every single aspect of what humans can endure. And that's not a small thing to consider. How many of us in our day struggle with at least discouragement, low self-esteem? We're easily shattered when someone says we're not good enough. But even that there are really such a significant number of us where it goes to the extent of even what we call clinical depression. That point where there really doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. And even though we rationally say, well, of course I know that God is there, even say, well, some well-meaning person will say to this person who's in despair, well, God is with you. And well, yeah, I know he's there. And frankly, right now, that's not helpful. Because it doesn't matter what your head knows to be true. There's another part of us that is just as powerful, sometimes more so, that we like to think of as our heart. Obviously, our heart doesn't quite work like that, but whatever that is, that kind of soul and our spirit, the very essence of who we are, can be devastated. So much so that we really don't see any way forward. Obviously, sometimes even a tragic end. This is that moment that goes beyond saying, well, God is with you. No, this is when it says God is there. God has gone before you. God has experienced the worst level of pain and feeling of betrayal, dejection that any of us ever can. So much so that even though we rationally know it's not true, it even feels like we can't find God. Where is God in the midst of this? I don't know. That's where Jesus resides in this moment. The second piece is that you absolutely must connect it to Psalm 22, because it is one of a number of so-called Psalms of lament. And one of the precious things about the Psalms is that they express the whole gamut of emotion. And that's a wonderful thing, you know. Sometimes, for some reason, we think that, God only wants to hear the good stuff from us. Hey, really thankful for this, and now that I've said thanks for 10 things, oh, by the way, if you want to do that, that'd be really helpful, and if you do that, I'll thank you for that tomorrow. Amen. But God is at that moment of pure despair and says, be honest about that, for heaven's sake. It's not like God doesn't know what you're thinking, what you're feeling. So be vulnerable. Tell God, this is really unbelievable. I never thought my life would get to this point. And frankly, I'm chatting with you and I'm praying, and so I know rationally you're there, but I don't know where you are, and I don't know where I'm supposed to go. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And in all of those Psalms of lament, they start out with basically going, God, this is not good. And I don't know where you are. I don't know how to move forward. And so it comes ever so close to saying kind of like, God, come on, show up. But they always turn when it gets toward the end of that psalm and says in one way or another, but I have the history of all the ways you have worked with people like me before, people that have been in great despair, people who couldn't see a way forward. And somehow you saw them through. So I'm confident that your steadfast love is there for me, and that even though I can't see it now, you will bring me successfully through this. That's what you're supposed to hear. It is really words of hope out of the context of absolute despair. The fifth word. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, he saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. So I guess even the other guy wasn't always saying proper things. John 19. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. This seems like just the horrible icing on the cake. I mean, if you've ever dared to read what people who consider themselves to be experts say about what it is like to be crucified, to die in such a manner, it will make you nauseous. And so here he is, Jesus experiencing everything that a human would. And so he says, I'm thirsty. He's being derided by all of these people. Even in the midst of his agony, as death now draws near for him, they only up the ante. And they give him some sour wine. Something of a joke, really. Take that, King of the Jews. So it is a harrowing tale for us. When life gets its most difficult, when God is honing in on exactly whatever he needs to be about, where are we? When God says, hey, partner with me, I have created you to be, in a sense, a co-creator. You are, according to the likes of people like Martin Luther, little Christs, because I honor you to that level. Yes, I could snap my fingers and make it happen, but I'm not going to, because I want to do it through you. You are my body. I want to be connected to you. And one way or another, our response is some sour wine. How often do we do that? When God says, this is your opportunity. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where times are really rough, and this is where you can make a difference. This is where I need you to show that you are a faithful follower. Do I give him sour wine? Do I join with the other 12 guys that to greater and lesser extents failed Jesus? You know, at least John and the women are at the cross. There's that. And Peter was close enough that he was in the crowd, but that was about it. You know, it was interesting. I read an article by a person who said, how come these preachers, assuming male, always, say that the disciples just abandoned Jesus? Well, the women didn't. Well, okay. Well, pretty much every Easter, I pick on the guys hiding in the house, and that the women were the ones who come and do what's necessary, and they're the ones who find out about Jesus and
have the first opportunity to see Jesus, particularly Mary Magdalene, who focuses that, she doesn't know what's going to happen. This is her moment of despair. But somehow, instinctually, she can't leave the tomb. Or she comes back, however you understand connecting all these stories together. But at some point, she is in front of the tomb, presumably by herself. And Jesus comes. She's aware of a present. She thinks it's a gardener. And he says, Mary. And Jesus said, the sheep shall know my voice. And so did Mary. So it is for us. In the direst of moments, we have the opportunity, a choice. Let's call that sour grapes. That fits in our linguistic usage. We can choose that. Or we can choose to be Mary, who says, I'm going to stick here until I find some resolution, until I find the way forward that God is looking for me. The sixth word. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, certainly this man was innocent. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those with him who kept watching over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly this man was God's Son." When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished."